My son-in-law looked me in the eye at Sunday dinner and called me a confused old man. 48 hours later, I found proof he had been using my 5-year-old granddaughter as collateral for a deal that would erase my family's history from Charleston forever. He thought a retired watchmaker could not fight a lawyer. He was about to learn that the man who cracks codes never forgets how to set a trap. Hello everyone, welcome to our story. Please like, subscribe, and comment where you are watching from. Important note: this is a fictional story with dramatized elements for storytelling purposes. Any similarities to real events are coincidental. But the lessons about trust, betrayal, and protection carry deep meaning. Now, let me tell you how it all began. The October air in Charleston carries a particular weight in the evenings, thick with the perfume of Confederate jasmine and the salt-tinged memory of a harbor that has witnessed centuries of secrets. I was standing at my kitchen counter, arranging the good china Doris always insisted we use for Sunday dinners, when I heard the crunch of tires on the oyster shell driveway. Jordan's black BMW pulled in first, followed by Natalie's silver Honda. My daughter stepped out carrying a casserole dish, her smile a fraction too wide, her eyes darting toward her husband with the quickness of a woman checking a weather vane before a storm. My name is Raymond Whitfield. I am 62 years old, a retired watchmaker and restorer of antique timepieces, and before that, I spent 23 years as a cryptographic analyst for the United States Army. I have lived in this house on Lagar Street since 1991. The same year, Doris and I pulled the overgrown magnolia roots from the garden and promised each other we would grow old beneath the wide piazza that had sheltered 4 generations of Whitfields before us. Doris kept that promise for 28 years before the Alzheimer's pulled her away from me, piece by piece, like a clock losing its gears, until only the empty case remained. The house itself is a Charleston single, built in 1890 by my great-grandfather, a freedman who laid every brick with hands that had known chains. The woodwork is original heart pine. The fireplaces are Italian marble shipped through the port 130 years ago. And the property is worth $1.8 million in today's inflated market. I mention this not out of vanity, but because that number is the exact reason Jordan Price decided to sit at my table every Sunday and pretend to be family. Dinner began the way it always did. Sophie climbed onto my lap before the food was served, her small fingers tracing the engraving on my pocket watch. "Tell me what it says, Grandpa." I read it to her the way I had 100 times. "All things in their proper time." She repeated the words with the seriousness of a child reciting scripture, and I kissed the crown of her blonde head, inhaling the clean soap and crayon scent of pure innocence. Jordan carved the roast with the theatrical confidence of a man who believes he owns every room he enters. He is 38, a real estate attorney with a corner office on Broad Street, and a smile that has the mechanical precision of a timepiece that runs perfectly on the surface but hides a cracked mainspring beneath. He spent the first half of dinner steering the conversation toward my health, my memory, my supposed difficulty keeping track of bills. Each question was a probe disguised as concern. "You forgot to pay the water bill again last month, Ray." Jordan said it casually, not even looking up from his plate. His tone carried the careful calibration of a man who has rehearsed his lines. "Maybe it is time we talked about letting Natalie and me handle some of the administrative burden. You know, just the accounts and the property taxes. Nothing major." I watched my daughter's fork pause mid-air. She did not correct him. She did not tell him I had not forgotten any bill in 62 years of living. The silence between them carried a frequency I recognized from my years in signals intelligence. The hum of a transmission that is not meant to be heard. Then he said it. The words that shifted the axis of my entire world. "Come on, Ray." He leaned back, his wineglass catching the candlelight. "You are getting confused more often. It is nothing to be ashamed of. Doris had her issues too, toward the end. We just want to make sure you are taken care of." He invoked my dead wife's name like a weapon. He compared my sharp, functioning mind to her stolen memories. And he did it in front of my granddaughter with the casual cruelty of a man who has already decided his victim is too old to fight back. I said nothing. I smiled the way a clockmaker smiles when he identifies the exact gear that has been grinding the mechanism to dust. Patience is not passivity. It is precision, waiting for its moment. After dessert, as Natalie cleared the plates with that nervous energy she had carried since childhood, Jordan reached into his briefcase and produced a wooden box, a peace offering wrapped in false generosity. Inside sat a Breguet pocket watch, mid-19th century, with a cracked crystal and a sluggish escapement. Found this at an estate sale. Jordan set it on the table between us. Figured you could tinker with it in that little workshop of yours. Give you something to do. Keep the mind active. Right? I took the watch with steady hands, feeling the weight of it, the cold brass against my palm. It was a beautiful piece, worth perhaps $8,000 fully restored. But as my thumb traced the case back, I felt something else. A slight imbalance in the weight distribution that had nothing to do with the movement inside. Something was in this watch that did not belong to any horological mechanism ever built. I thanked him with the warmth of a grandfather who does not suspect a thing. I walked them to the door at 9:15, kissed Sophie goodnight, and watched the taillights disappear down Leaguer Street into the thick Charleston dark. Then I carried the Breguet to my workshop at the back of the garden, the familiar creak of the wooden steps beneath my boots grounding me in the silence. I sat at my bench under the amber glow of my jeweler's lamp, the smell of brass polish and machine oil settling over me like a second skin. I selected my finest screwdriver and began to open the case back with the deliberate patience of a man who has disarmed more complex devices than a pocket watch. The movement was genuine. A beautiful hand-finished caliber that deserved better than whatever Jordan had planned. But there, wedged between the mainspring barrel and the balance cock, secured with a sliver of electrical tape that no 19th century craftsman would ever use, sat a micro SD card smaller than my thumbnail. And that is when the ticking in my workshop became the loudest sound in the world. I did not sleep that night. The micro SD card sat on my workbench like a splinter of black glass, no larger than the nail on my smallest finger, yet carrying a weight that made the air in my workshop feel thin and combustible. I stared at it for a long time under the jeweler's lamp, turning it over with my tweezers, examining the electrical tape residue on its edges. Whoever placed it inside, that Breguet had done so with intention. The watch was not a gift. It was a delivery system, and my workshop was the dead drop. At 11:43 on that Sunday night, I carried the card to the small office alcove at the back of my workshop, where I keep a dedicated laptop, a machine I purchased specifically because it has never been connected to my home network. Old habits from the intelligence community die hard. I inserted the card into the reader and watched the drive populate with a folder structure that made my throat tighten. 3 files. The first was labeled Whitfield, Deed, Transfer, Finale. The second, Hargrove, Price, Agreement, Executed. The third carried no readable name, only a string of hexadecimal characters that my trained eye immediately recognized as an AES 256 encryption header, military grade. The kind of protection that governments use for classified communications and that no real estate attorney in Charleston, South Carolina, has any legitimate reason to possess. I opened the first file. The document that filled my screen was a warranty deed transferring ownership of my home, the house my great-grandfather built with his own freed hands in 1890, from Raymond A. Whitfield to a limited liability company called Palmetto Heritage Holdings. The transfer date was set for November 15th. 6 weeks from that Sunday night. My signature sat at the bottom of the page in what appeared to be flawless replication of my handwriting. Every loop, every pressure point, every characteristic tremor that age has introduced to my script was reproduced with forensic precision. But I know my own hand the way a watchmaker knows the rhythm of a balance wheel. The downstroke on the W was 3 degrees too steep. The crossbar on the T in Whitfield carried a mechanical uniformity that no human hand produces naturally. It was a forgery, and it was nearly perfect. Nearly. The second file made my blood run cold in a way that the forged deed alone could not. It was a fully executed purchase agreement between Palmetto Heritage Holdings and Hargrove Development Corporation for the sale of my property at $1.8 million. The agreement included a demolition clause. Article 7, Section 3, stated in clinical legal language that the existing structure would be raised within 90 days of closing to accommodate the construction of a 12-unit luxury condominium development. I read that clause 3 times. Raised. They intended to tear down 130 years of history, of blood and memory, and the heartwood floors Doris danced across on our wedding night to build condominiums for tourists who would never know whose hands laid those bricks. I felt a tremor in my fingers that had nothing to do with age. It was rage, a deep seismic fury that I had not felt since the day the doctors told me Doris would not remember my name by Christmas. The purchase agreement was signed by 2 parties. Victor Hargrove, president of Hargrove Development, a name I recognized from the glossy billboards that had been consuming the old neighborhoods of Charleston like a slow-moving fire, and Jordan Price, acting as attorney in fact, for Raymond A. Whitfield, under a general durable power of attorney. I did not grant Jordan power of attorney. I have never signed such a document in my life, but there it was on my screen. A second forged signature beneath a legal instrument that gave my son-in-law total control over my property, my accounts, and my financial identity. The notary stamp beside it bore a date from March of this year, a Tuesday when Natalie and Jordan had taken me to lunch at Husk and insisted I sign what Jordan described as a simple healthcare directive update. I remembered his hand covering the bottom half of the page as he pointed to the signature line. I remembered his smile. Have you ever discovered that the people eating at your table have been measuring you for a coffin? It is not a sudden pain. It is a slow freezing of the blood that starts in your chest and spreads outward until your entire body feels like it belongs to someone else. I sat in the amber light of my workshop, the smell of brass and old wood surrounding me, and I thought of Doris. She would have seen through him. She always possessed the ability to read the gears behind a person's smile, to hear the frequencies that others missed. But Doris was gone, and I had been too consumed by grief to notice that a predator had moved into the empty space she left behind. I turned my attention to the 3rd file, the encrypted one. My fingers moved across the keyboard with the muscle memory of 2 decades spent breaking codes for the United States government. AES 256 is not a casual encryption. It requires a specific key or passphrase, and brute forcing it would take longer than the remaining lifespan of the sun. But the hexadecimal header contained a metadata tag that most amateurs overlook when they encrypt files using consumer software. The tag revealed the encryption application, a commercial program called VaultLock Pro that stores its key derivation salt in a predictable location within the file structure. I spent 47 minutes extracting the salt, running it against a dictionary of common passphrases weighted toward legal and financial terminology. At 12:31 in the morning, the file cracked open like a vault door swinging on silent hinges. The passphrase was Palmetto Deal 2024, and I felt a grim satisfaction that Jordan's arrogance extended even to his choice of security. Inside was a single video file. I pressed play and watched my son-in-law sitting across a polished conference table from a broad-shouldered man in a charcoal suit whose face I recognized from those billboards. Victor Hargrove. Jordan was accepting a thick manila envelope, the unmistakable shape of banded cash visible through the open flap. 50,000, Hargrove said on the recording, his voice carrying the oiled confidence of a man accustomed to purchasing people. That covers the notary and your trouble. The rest comes when the old man's signature dries on the closing docs. Jordan's laugh was a sound I had heard 1,000 times at my dinner table, but in this context, framed by the blue glow of a laptop screen in my darkened workshop, it sounded like the mechanical click of a trap being set. A trap designed for me. The video ended. The screen went black. And in the silence that followed, I heard only the ticking of the workshop clock and the slow, measured rhythm of my own breathing. The kind of encryption a real estate lawyer has no business knowing how to use, unless someone gave it to him. And unless that someone had far more to lose than a house, I spent all of Monday in a state of controlled stillness that would have looked like paralysis to anyone watching. But inside, my mind was running at a frequency I had not accessed in years. The cold, analytical hum of a cryptographer who has intercepted a transmission and now needs to map the full network before making a single move. The documents on that micro SD card told me what Jordan was doing. They did not tell me why a real estate attorney earning $200,000 a year would risk disbarment and federal prison for a $50,000 bribe. There was pressure behind his actions, and pressure always has a source. By Tuesday morning, I had my answer. But I wish to God I had not. The smart home system in my house was something I installed 3 years ago during Doris's decline, a network of sensors, speakers, and microphones designed to alert me if she wandered at night or called for help from another room. After she passed, I kept the system active out of habit. The way a man keeps a light on in an empty hallway because darkness reminds him of what he has lost. Jordan knew about the system. He had even complimented it once, calling it impressive for a man of my generation. What Jordan did not know was that the system's administrative controls were still accessible from my workshop terminal through an encrypted bridge I built during installation, a redundancy protocol from my military days that routes audio through a frequency band most consumer devices cannot detect. On Tuesday at 8:40 in the morning, I activated the internal microphones from my workshop and began monitoring my own living room. I felt a sickness in doing it, a violation of the domestic peace Doris and I had maintained for decades. But peace is a luxury reserved for homes that are not under siege. The first transmission came at 9:12. Jordan's voice, sharp and aggressive, filled my headphones with a clarity that made my skin tighten. He was in my living room. He had let himself in with a key I never gave him, a copy he must have made during one of his Sunday visits while I was occupied with Sophie in the garden. Natalie was with him. I could hear her breathing, quick and shallow, the rhythm of a woman bracing for impact. "You do not get to have second thoughts now, Natalie." Jordan's voice carried the cold precision of a closing argument. "We are past that. The filing happens Friday. Your father signs the updated directive. We record the deed. And this is over." My daughter's response was barely audible, a whispered protest that sounded like it had been worn thin by repetition. "He is going to notice, Jordan. He is sharper than you think. He fixed codes for the army." Jordan laughed. The same laugh from the video. The same mechanical click. "He fixed codes 20 years ago, Natalie. Now he fixes clocks and forgets to eat lunch. He is an old man living in a museum, and if you do not cooperate, you will not be living with Sophie at all." The silence that followed was a frequency I recognized. It was the sound of capitulation, the moment a signal stops resisting encryption and simply submits to the key being forced into it. "I want you to understand something." Jordan's voice dropped to a register that made the hair on my forearms rise. "If this deal falls through, if Hargrove does not get his closing by November 15th, the custody motion I have prepared goes to Judge Hammond on Monday. Full custody. Sole legal authority. You will not see Sophie on Christmas morning, Natalie. You will not see her on her birthday. Do you understand what I am telling you?" I gripped the edge of my workbench until the wood grain pressed white lines into my palms. He was not asking Natalie to help him steal from me. He was holding my granddaughter hostage to ensure her compliance. Sophie was not just caught in the crossfire. She was the ammunition. Natalie's voice cracked when she finally spoke. "Just tell me it will be over after Friday. Promise me. Sophie stays with me." Jordan did not answer her question. Instead, I heard him dial a number on speakerphone, and a new voice entered my workshop through the headphones, a voice I had never heard before, deep, unhurried, with the flat affect of a man who conducts unpleasant business as routine. "Marcus." Jordan's tone shifted to something almost deferential. "We are on schedule. Friday closing. Hargrove confirmed the demolition crew for December 1st. The voice called Marcus responded with a single question that turned my blood to ice water. "And the school situation? We still good on the 3:15 window?" Jordan answered without hesitation. his voice carrying the clinical detachment of a man reading coordinates off a map. Ashley Hall. Monday through Friday. Pickup is at 3:15 at the Rutledge Avenue gate. The grandmother usually gets her. But on Wednesdays, Natalie is alone. That is your window if we need one. I pulled the headphones from my ears as if they had caught fire. My hands were shaking. A tremor that had nothing to do with age or the cold October air seeping through the workshop walls. My granddaughter, 5 years old, blonde hair that catches the Charleston sun like spun copper. Small fingers that trace the engravings on my pocket watch every Sunday. Jordan had given a stranger her exact location, her exact schedule, her exact vulnerability. He had drawn a map to my granddaughter and handed it to a man whose voice carried the practiced calm of someone accustomed to applying pressure to fragile things. Have you ever heard the sound of a gear breaking inside a mechanism you love? It is not loud. It is a small, precise snap, followed by a silence that tells you nothing will ever keep proper time again. I sat in the dark of my workshop, the only light, the pale amber glow of the frequency monitor blinking in the corner, and I realized I was not just fighting a son-in-law anymore. I was fighting a machine, a system of leverage and coercion and greed that had been running in the walls of my family for months without my knowing. And my 5-year-old granddaughter was caught between its gears. The clock on my workshop wall read 9:51 on a Tuesday morning. I had until Friday. 72 hours to dismantle a machine that had been built specifically to destroy everything I loved. I reached for my phone, my hand steady now with the cold precision of a man who has finally identified the exact point of failure. I knew who to call first. The same woman Doris had trusted when the world began to slip away from her. Judge Constance Bellamy lives in the house immediately south of mine, separated by a wrought iron fence laced with Carolina jessamine that Doris planted the spring we moved in. For 31 years, Connie has been more than a neighbor. She served 22 years on the South Carolina Circuit Court before retiring at 70. And in the 6 years since, she has maintained the sharpest legal mind on the peninsula while pretending to be nothing more than an elderly woman who grows camellias and drinks Earl Grey on her piazza. Doris knew better. I have always known better. I walked through the garden gate at 7:15 on Tuesday evening. A folder under my arm containing printouts of every document from the micro SD card, organized in the precise sequential order a judge would expect. She opened the door before I reached the top step. Her silver reading glasses pushed into the crown of white hair she kept in a loose knot. Her dark eyes moved from my face to the folder, and I watched her posture shift from neighborly welcome to judicial attention in a single breath. Raymond. She said my name the way she once addressed attorneys in her courtroom. You look like a man carrying more than paper. I followed her into the library at the back of her house, a room lined floor to ceiling with leather volumes that smelled of old tobacco and lemon oil. She poured Earl Grey without asking, the bergamot mixing with the leather and the faint gardenia drifting from the open window. I opened the folder and laid the documents before her one by one. The forged deed, the Hargrove agreement, the power of attorney, the still frame of Jordan accepting $50,000 in a manila envelope. I said nothing as she read. I let the evidence speak with the quiet force of facts arranged in proper sequence. Connie took 11 minutes to review everything. I counted the ticks of the grandfather clock against the far wall, a George Graham Long case from 1740 that I restored for her late husband. When she looked up, her expression carried the controlled fury of a jurist who has seen this pattern destroy lives before. Victor Hargrove. She said the name like a diagnosis. 3 years ago, the Preservation Board referred his King Street demolition to the State Attorney General, but the case collapsed when the primary witness recanted. We never had direct evidence of his methods. She tapped the still frame. Until now. She explained that Hargrove manufactured consent through a network of compromised attorneys and forged instruments, targeting elderly homeowners whose families could be leveraged. My house was not his first target. It was merely his most valuable. There is a mechanism available to you, Raymond. The Historic Preservation Board can issue an emergency designation for properties of significant cultural heritage. Once filed, no transfer. No demolition can proceed without full board review. It freezes everything completely. I felt the first stirring of strategic momentum. But Connie was not finished. She removed her glasses and reached into the bottom drawer of her desk, withdrawing a cream-colored envelope whose edges had softened with time. It was sealed with a small circle of wax bearing a tiny hourglass, a brass stamp I had carved for Doris on our 10th anniversary. "Your wife came to me." Connie's voice was quieter now. 6 months before the disease took her memory completely. She was lucid that day, Raymond. Perfectly lucid. And she was frightened. My hands went still on the mahogany surface. The grandfather clock ticked. The jasmine from the window suddenly smelled like memory itself. Doris had noticed Jordan copying documents in my office. She had overheard him mention Hargrove by name on the phone. She had found a business card from Hargrove Development in his jacket with a handwritten note reading Whitfield Property, confirmed. She was building a case the way a watchmaker assembles a movement, one tiny component at a time. But the Alzheimer's was advancing faster than her investigation. "She told me to give you this if the day ever came." Connie placed the envelope between us. "I loved her too, Raymond. She made me promise to wait until you found the evidence yourself. She said you needed to see it with your own eyes before you would believe your daughter was involved." I stared at the envelope. My name in Doris's elegant cursive. "Raymond, my love." The ink slightly faded. The paper carrying the ghost of her lavender hand cream. I could not open it. Not yet. Not until my hands stopped trembling. "Thank you, Connie." My voice barely rose above a whisper. "How long have you been waiting?" 3 years, Raymond." She picked up her tea. "And I have been waiting for Victor Hargrove even longer." I stood, the envelope pressed against my chest. As I reached her library door, Connie spoke once more, with the resonance of a gavel falling. "File the historic designation tomorrow morning. I will activate the board for an emergency session by Friday. And Raymond." She paused until I turned. "South Carolina is a one-party consent state. Every recording you have made in your own home is fully admissible. Remember that." I walked back through the garden gate, the jasmine closing around me like a curtain between worlds. The envelope against my heart felt heavier than any document I had carried in 62 years. Doris had seen the fracture in our foundation long before I noticed the walls beginning to lean. And she had left me the blueprint for saving what remained. Wednesday morning broke over Charleston with a pale October light that turned the harbor into a sheet of hammered silver. I was in my truck by 6:45, dressed in the pressed khaki trousers and blue Oxford shirt that I wear when I need the world to see a respectable retired gentleman rather than a man waging a silent war. The folder from Connie's house sat in my briefcase, alongside certified copies of my original deed, my authentic signature samples, and a notarized affidavit of identity I had prepared at midnight, using the portable notary stamp. Doris insisted we keep in the house safe, 48 hours until Friday. Every minute was a gear that needed to turn in perfect sequence. First National Bank on Broad Street opens its doors at 8:30. I was the second person through them, my leather shoes clicking against the marble floor. With a rhythm I forced to remain steady, I asked to see Andrea Colvin, my personal banker of 14 years, a woman who had handled the transition of Doris's accounts after the funeral with a discretion I still appreciated. She led me to her glass-walled office. Offered coffee I declined, and listened as I explained with clinical precision that I had reason to believe unauthorized access had been made to my financial accounts. Andrea's fingers moved across her keyboard with increasing urgency as I spoke. Within 3 minutes, she confirmed what I had feared. Jordan Price had opened a revolving line of credit in the amount of $200,000 using the forged power of attorney as authorization. The account had been active since April. $63,000 had already been drawn against it. I watched the color shift in Andrea's face as she cross-referenced the authorization documents against the revocation order I placed on her desk. "Mr. Whitfield, this power of attorney is fraudulent. Her voice dropped to a professional whisper. The notary listed here was flagged by our compliance department 6 months ago in connection with another disputed filing. I need to escalate this immediately. I told her to freeze every account connected to my social security number. I authorized a full forensic audit. I changed every password, every security question, every recovery email to protocols that required my physical presence and a biometric confirmation. As Andrea processed the lockdown, she paused and looked up at me with an expression that told me my timing had been measured in hours rather than days. I should tell you something, Mr. Whitfield. She glanced at her screen. Jordan Price called this office at 7:58 this morning, asking about same-day wire transfer limits for amounts exceeding $100,000. That was 32 minutes before you walked in. 32 minutes. The margin between losing everything and catching the wire before it left the vault. I felt the precision of that number settle into my chest, like the click of a lock engaging. I thanked Andrea, collected my documentation, and walked out into the Broad Street morning, with my briefcase feeling lighter and my spine feeling straighter. The second stop was the Charleston County Historic Preservation Office on Meeting Street. The building smells of old plaster and archival paper, a scent that reminded me of Doris's obsession with local history. I met with Thomas Gaillard, the Deputy Preservation Officer, a lean man in his 50s who wore a bow tie, and spoke with the careful diction of someone who understands that buildings are not just structures, but living testimony. I presented my application for emergency historic designation of the Whitfield property at 14 Legger Street, including documentation of the house's construction in 1890 by my great-grandfather, its continuous family ownership across 4 generations, and its architectural significance as one of the last unaltered Charleston singles, built by a freedman in the Reconstruction era. Gaillard reviewed the application with a reverence that I recognized as genuine. Mr. Whitfield, this qualifies without question. He stamped the intake form. Given the documented demolition threat, I can recommend emergency status to the board within 24 hours. Once approved, no sale, no alteration, no transfer can proceed without full board review and a 60-day public comment period. I signed the forms and felt another gear engage. The house was now protected by something older and stronger than any deed Jordan could forge. History itself. It was 12:15 when I turned my truck onto Rutledge Avenue, heading home through the route that passes Ashley Hall School. The oak canopy along the street was heavy with Spanish moss, casting dappled shadows across the pavement that made the world feel dreamlike and slow. Sophie would be in her afternoon session now, probably painting or singing the alphabet song she had been practicing for the school concert. I almost missed it. A black Cadillac Escalade, current model year, parked beneath the largest oak directly across from the school's wrought iron Rutledge Avenue gate. The windows were tinted dark enough to be illegal in South Carolina. The engine was running, a thin shimmer of exhaust rising from the tailpipe into the cool October air. And in the driver's side mirror, as I passed at 20 miles per hour with my eyes fixed forward, I caught the reflection of a broad-shouldered figure holding a phone aimed at the school entrance. He was not waiting for a child. He was photographing the pickup zone, documenting the sight lines and the gaps in supervision, building a tactical map of my granddaughter's daily vulnerability. I drove past without slowing, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, the taste of copper flooding the back of my throat. Marcus Webb was not a future threat. He was already operational, and the Wednesday window Jordan had mentioned on the phone was not next week. It was today. I circled the block once, memorizing the license plate. Georgia tags. Fulton County. I pulled into a side street, reached for my phone, and made 2 calls. The first was to Ashley Hall's front office, identifying myself as Sophie's grandfather and requesting immediate early dismissal for a family appointment. The second was to Charleston Police Department's non-emergency line, reporting a suspicious vehicle conducting surveillance of a private school. 14 minutes later, I walked Sophie through the school's side entrance, her small hand warm in mine, her backpack bouncing as she skipped along the sidewalk, asking why Grandpa was picking her up early. I told her we were going to get ice cream. It was not entirely a lie. We did stop at Jenny's on King Street, but the real reason was that I could not bear the thought of her standing at that gate at 3:15 while a man in a black Escalade measured her life in angles and distances. As I buckled her into the back seat of my truck with chocolate on her chin and a smile that made the October sun feel warm again, she said something that stopped my heart entirely. "Grandpa, that man in the black car was here yesterday too." He waved at me through the fence during recess. The ice cream turned to ash in my stomach. Yesterday, they had been watching her longer than I knew, and Jordan had handed them her schedule, like passing a house key to a burglar. I did not sleep Wednesday night. The image of a man waving at my granddaughter through a school fence burned behind my eyelids every time I closed them. A slow exposure photograph that developed darker with each passing hour. Sophie's words played on a loop in my mind with the relentless precision of an escapement that cannot be silenced. Yesterday, too. He had been there Monday. He had been there Tuesday. He had waved at her like a neighbor, like a friendly stranger, conditioning her to see his presence as normal. It was not surveillance. It was grooming a target. By Thursday morning at 6, I had a plan that carried the cold geometry of a military operation. I dressed in dark clothes, pocketed my phone with the camera set to burst mode, and drove to Rutledge Avenue 40 minutes before school opened. I parked 3 blocks south of Ashley Hall beneath a magnolia whose low branches provided natural concealment for my truck. Then I waited with the patience of a man who spent 2 decades intercepting signals in rooms where breathing too loudly could compromise an entire operation. At 7:22, the black Escalade turned onto Rutledge from the Calhoun Street intersection. Georgia plates. Fulton County. The same vehicle. It parked in the identical spot beneath the largest oak. Engine idling. Windows dark. I raised my phone and began capturing images through my passenger window, the telephoto lens pulling the vehicle's details into sharp focus. License plate. Front windshield inspection sticker. The faint outline of a figure behind the tinted glass. At 7:38, teachers began arriving through the staff entrance. At 7:45, the first parents pulled into the circular drive to drop off their children. And at 7:51, the Escalade's driver door opened and Marcus Webb stepped out. He was larger than his voice had suggested on Jordan's speakerphone call. Broad through the shoulders, with a shaved head and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same granite as the Calhoun Monument downtown. He wore a black athletic jacket and carried a phone that he held at chest height, angled toward the gate with the deliberate posture of a man documenting a location rather than checking his messages. He walked slowly along the sidewalk, pausing at the wrought iron fence where the pickup line forms at dismissal. He photographed the gate. He photographed the sight line, from the sidewalk to the front entrance. He checked his watch and made a note on his phone. I captured everything. 37 photographs in 4 minutes. His face. His hands. His phone angled at the school. His position relative to the gate where Sophie stands every afternoon waiting for her mother or her grandfather. Each image was a gear in the mechanism I was building, and each one locked into place with the precision of a Swiss caliber. At 7:55, as the first school bell rang across the October morning, Webb returned to the Escalade and pulled away heading east, toward the interstate. I noted the time and direction in my phone, then immediately called the Charleston Police Department. Not the non-emergency line this time. I asked for the Detective Bureau. "My name is Raymond Whitfield. I am reporting an individual conducting repeated surveillance of Ashley Hall School on Rutledge Avenue. I have photographic evidence spanning 2 days showing the same vehicle and driver documenting the student pickup zone and perimeter fencing. I believe a specific child is being targeted." The detective who took my statement was a woman named Reeves, her voice sharp and professional. She asked me to forward the photographs and the license plate information to a secure email. She asked if I knew the identity of the individual. I told her the man's first name was Marcus, that he was connected to a real estate developer named Victor Hargrove, and that my granddaughter, Sophie Price, attended the school. I did not mention Jordan's involvement yet. That card would be played at the proper time, in the proper venue, with the proper audience. Detective Reeves assured me that a patrol unit would be assigned to the Rutledge Avenue corridor during school hours effective immediately. She asked if I wanted to file for a temporary restraining order. I told her yes. I told her I wanted it processed before Friday. When I picked Sophie up at 2:45 that afternoon, I used the staff entrance again, walking through the administrative corridor with a visitor badge clipped to my shirt. The principal, a composed woman named Dr. Harriman, met me at the office door. She had already received a call from Detective Reeves and had implemented what she called enhanced perimeter protocols. No child would be released at the Rutledge gate until further notice. All dismissals would be conducted through the monitored interior courtyard. Sophie was painting when I found her in the art room, her small fingers covered in blue and gold tempera that matched the sky outside. She looked up at me with a smile that contained no knowledge of surveillance vehicles or men with cameras aimed at her life. "Grandpa." I painted the clock tower. She held up a watercolor that vaguely resembled St. Michael's steeple. Its clock face, a cheerful yellow circle with uneven numbers. "It is beautiful, Sophie." I crouched beside her, inhaling the clean tempera and paper smell that surrounded her like a force field of innocence. "You even got the hands in the right position." She leaned close, her breath warm and sweet against my ear. "Can we go to your workshop today? I want to help you fix the broken one." I took her home. We spent the afternoon in my workshop. Sophie perched on the tall stool I built for her last Christmas, watching me calibrate a balance wheel on a 1920s Hamilton pocket watch. She asked questions about every tool, every movement, every tiny screw I placed on the felt tray. I answered each one with the full attention of a man who understands that these hours are not guaranteed. At 4:30, Natalie arrived to collect her. She looked thinner than Sunday. The circles beneath her eyes deeper, her cardigan pulled tight around her frame like armor. She did not come inside. She waited on the piazza, and when Sophie ran to her with blue-stained fingers and a pocket watch drawing clutched in her fist, I saw Natalie's jaw tighten with the effort of holding something back. "Is everything okay, Dad?" She asked it without looking at me, her eyes fixed on Sophie buckling into the car seat. "Everything is fine, Natalie." I kept my voice steady, warm, measured. The mask of the confused old man still firmly in place. "Just enjoying time with my granddaughter." She nodded once, quick and tight, and drove away. I stood on the piazza until the sound of her engine faded into the Charleston evening, the Spanish moss swaying in a breeze that smelled of salt and coming rain. 36 hours until Friday. Marcus Webb was documented. The police were engaged. The school was locked down. Sophie was safe for now. But the recording I needed, the one that would bring the entire machine crashing down, was still waiting to be captured. And Jordan was bringing it to my living room tomorrow. They came to my house on Thursday afternoon thinking I was at the hardware store. Jordan had called me at 1:15 with a casual inquiry about my plans for the day. The kind of question a concerned son-in-law might ask an aging father. I told him I was heading to Lowe's for wood stain and would be gone most of the afternoon. He said that was nice, that keeping busy was good for the mind. His voice carried the same mechanical warmth of a clock that chimes on schedule regardless of whether anyone is listening. I was not at Lowe's. I was in my workshop with the door closed, the smart home monitoring system active on my encrypted terminal, and a pair of studio-grade headphones clamped over my ears. At 1:42, I heard the front door of my house open. Jordan's footsteps on the heart pine floors are distinctive, a confident heel strike that echoes through the hallway with the entitlement of a man who already considers the space his own. A second set of footsteps followed. Heavier, deliberate, the measured tread of someone accustomed to walking into rooms they intend to purchase. Victor Hargrove's voice was exactly as it sounded on the encrypted video. A deep baritone polished smooth by decades of boardrooms and backroom negotiations. But hearing it live inside my own home, in the space where Doris and I raised our daughter, and where Sophie takes her afternoon naps on the parlor sofa, created a visceral revulsion that tightened my jaw until my molars ached. Jordan offered him coffee. He used my machine, my beans, my cups. I listened to the familiar gurgle of the espresso maker and felt a cold fury settle behind my sternum like a stone. They sat in my living room, on the furniture Doris selected, beneath the crown molding my great-grandfather carved by hand, and they discussed the timeline for erasing 130 years of my family's existence. The demolition crew is confirmed for December 1st. Hargrove's voice carried the clinical satisfaction of a surgeon scheduling a procedure. Permits are filed under the LLC. The Historical Society won't flag it until it's already rubble. By then, the appeals process favors the developer. I've done this 4 times, Jordan. Trust the system. Jordan's response was faster, higher-pitched, carrying the frayed edges of a man under pressure he can no longer fully conceal. What about the old man? If he contests the deed after filing, we're exposed. The notary is already nervous. Hargrove laughed. A low sound devoid of warmth. That's what the guardianship petition is for. You file the deed Friday. Monday morning, your wife files an emergency guardianship, citing cognitive decline. By the time he hires a lawyer to contest, the property is recorded under the LLC, and the demolition clock is ticking. He cannot unring that bell from a memory care facility, Jordan. Memory care facility. They intended to put me in a locked ward. To argue, before a judge, that my mind was failing, that I was a danger to myself, that I needed the protection of the very people dismantling my life. I thought of Doris in her final months, the fluorescent lights of the facility where she spent her last weeks, the smell of antiseptic and cafeteria food that replaced the jasmine and mahogany of our home. They wanted to bury me alive in the same institutional silence that swallowed my wife. Have you ever sat in the dark and listened to 2 men plan the end of your life while drinking coffee from your own cups? The rage does not come as heat. It comes as cold. A deep structural freeze that hardens everything it touches into something unbreakable. Jordan pressed further, his anxiety surfacing in rapid-fire questions about the timeline. What if the bank flags the transfer? What about the credit line balance? Hargrove waved away each concern with the dismissiveness of a man who has insulated himself from consequences for so long that he no longer believes they exist. Then the conversation took a turn that revealed the full architecture of Jordan's captivity. Hargrove leaned forward, the leather of my sofa creaking under his shifting weight. Let me remind you of something, counselor. His voice dropped to a register that was no longer business. It was threat. I have a high-definition video of you accepting $50,000 in cash across my conference table. That video is currently stored in 3 separate cloud locations with a dead man's switch tied to my personal calendar. If I do not enter a specific code every 72 hours, that video goes directly to the South Carolina Bar Association, the Charleston County District Attorney, and your wife. The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. I counted each one against the ticking of my workshop clock. Jordan's voice, when it finally emerged, was stripped of all its courtroom confidence. It sounded young, cornered, desperate. I understand. Victor. Friday. Everything goes through Friday. Hargrove stood. I heard the creak of the floorboards under his weight as he moved toward the hallway. One more thing. If for any reason the old man becomes difficult before Friday, I want you to remind your friend Marcus that the Wednesday window at the school was not a one-time authorization. That asset remains active until I say otherwise. Asset. He called my granddaughter an asset. A 5-year-old girl who paints clock towers and asks her grandfather to teach her how things work. Victor Hargrove reduced her to a pressure point in a real estate transaction, a piece of collateral no different from the bricks and mortar he intended to demolish. The front door closed at 2:27. I sat in my workshop for a long time after they left, the headphones still on my ears, the recording still cycling through its buffer, the silence of my empty house transmitted through the microphones with a hollow resonance that sounded like the inside of a coffin. I had everything I needed. Every word of the demolition timeline. every detail of the guardianship scheme, every syllable of Hargrove's threat to deploy Marcus Webb against Sophie, every confession spoken freely inside the walls of my own home. A one-party consent state, where the homeowner is the party and the walls themselves are witnesses. I removed the headphones and placed them carefully on the workbench beside the breguet that started everything. The clock on the wall read 2:35 on a Thursday afternoon, 18 hours until Friday morning. 18 hours until Jordan and Hargrove walked back into my living room, expecting to find a confused old man ready to sign away his legacy. They would find something else entirely. But first, I needed to build the stage. And I knew exactly who would provide the audience. Thursday evening settled over Charleston with the slow-moving weight of a tide coming in. The light through my workshop windows turned amber, then copper, then finally the deep indigo of an October night, carrying the salt-heavy breath of the harbor. I had 12 hours. 12 hours to build a stage, wire it for broadcast, and ensure that every word spoken in my living room tomorrow morning would reach the ears of people with the authority to end this permanently. I called Connie Bellamy at 6:15. She answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the brisk clarity of a woman who had been expecting this call. "It is happening tomorrow morning, Connie. 9:30. They are coming to my house for the final signing. Hargrove will be with him." I heard the soft click of her setting down a teacup. "Good. The board has been notified. Emergency session convenes at 9 in the conference room at Preservation Hall on Meeting Street. 14 members confirmed." She paused, and when she continued, her voice carried a new weight. "I made a second call this afternoon. Raymond, Agent Dawson with the FBI field office in North Charleston, has been investigating Hargrove's network for 18 months. He has agreed to observe the session in an advisory capacity. If what you capture tomorrow contains the elements you described, he is prepared to act immediately. FBI." The word carried a gravity that made the workshop air feel thinner. This was no longer a family dispute or a civil matter. Federal agents do not observe advisory sessions unless they are preparing to execute warrants. Victor Hargrove had attracted the attention of people who build cases measured in decades rather than days. I asked Connie about the technical requirements. She explained that the Preservation Board conference room was equipped with a secure video feed system used for remote testimony during public hearings. All I needed was to establish a stable, encrypted connection from my living room to their receiving terminal. She provided the access credentials and the encryption key, dictating the 32-character string while I transcribed it onto the back of a business card with the precision of a cryptographer copying a one-time pad. The technology itself was simple. 3 concealed wide-angle cameras positioned in my living room, fed through my home network to a dedicated streaming server that would broadcast in real time to the Preservation Hall conference room. I had installed the cameras months ago as part of the smart home upgrade. Small units, no larger than a shirt button, embedded in the crown, molding at angles that covered every corner of the room. Jordan had complimented them once, thinking they were motion sensors. He was half right. I spent 2 hours testing the connection, adjusting frame rates, checking audio levels, ensuring the stream was stable enough to transmit without buffering or dropout. I ran the feed on a loop, watching my empty living room from 3 angles on my workshop monitor. The familiar furniture rendered strange and clinical by the surveillance perspective. The sofa where Hargrove had sat that afternoon. The coffee table where Jordan would place the forged deed tomorrow. The mantel where Doris's anniversary clock ticked away the hours with the steady patience she had always embodied. At 9:45, satisfied that the system was operational, I sat down at my workbench and reached for the cream-colored envelope that had been sitting in my breast pocket since Tuesday night. Doris's handwriting. My name in her elegant cursive. The hourglass wax seal unbroken for 3 years. I cracked the seal with my thumbnail and unfolded the single page inside. Her handwriting was steady, the letters formed with the discipline she maintained even as the disease began its slow theft. The lavender scent of her hand cream rose from the paper like a whisper from a room I could no longer enter. Raymond, my love, if you are reading this, then Connie has kept her promise. and the day I feared has arrived. I am sorry I could not tell you myself. By the time you read this, my mind will have taken what remains of my ability to warn you. I watched Jordan for months before the fog set in. He is not what he pretends to be. There are documents, Raymond, proof of what he is planning. But I could not keep them in the house where he might find them. So I put them in the one place only you would know to look. Remember our anniversary clock? The one you made for me in 1993. Remember the hidden compartment you built into the backplate because you said every good timepiece needs a secret? The answers are there, my love. I gathered what I could before the words started disappearing. Protect our girl. Protect Sophie. And forgive Natalie if you can. She does not see what I see. Not yet. All things in their proper time. Forever yours, Doris. I set the letter down on my workbench and pressed both palms flat against the wood grain until the trembling in my hands subsided. 3 years. She had been carrying this knowledge alone, racing against a disease that was erasing her mind faster than she could document the evidence. And in her final months of clarity, she had hidden what she found in the one place that Jordan would never think to look and that I would never open without cause, because the clock kept perfect time. And a watchmaker does not disassemble a mechanism that runs true. I stood and walked to the house, through the garden, and up the back steps into the parlor where the mantel holds 3 objects. A photograph of our wedding day, a brass candlestick from Doris's grandmother, and the anniversary clock I built for her in 1993, a walnut case with a hand-engraved faceplate and a hidden compartment behind the backplate that I constructed as a romantic gesture, a place to keep love letters small enough to fold into the space between the movement and the case wall. I lifted the clock with both hands, feeling its familiar weight, its perfect balance. The ticking continued as I turned it over, my fingers finding the small brass catch I had installed 31 years ago. The backplate released with a soft click, and there, sealed in a tiny waterproof bag, no larger than a postage stamp, sat a second micro SD card. Doris had been building her own case from the beginning, and she had hidden the evidence inside time itself. I carried the micro SD card back to my workshop like a man carrying a relic pulled from sacred ground. The walnut clock remained on the kitchen table where I had set it, its ticking continuing with the same faithful rhythm it had maintained for 31 years, indifferent to the secret it had kept hidden in its body all this time. Doris had placed her final act of protection inside a mechanism I built with my own hands, trusting that the hidden compartment designed for love letters would one day serve as a vault for the truth. The card slid into my laptop reader with a click that sounded louder than it should have in the midnight silence of my workshop. The drive populated with a folder labeled simply, "For Raymond." Inside were 4 files, each one named with a date that predated Doris's diagnosis by months. The first was a photograph taken from what appeared to be our upstairs hallway window. It showed Jordan standing beside a silver Mercedes in our driveway, accepting a large envelope from a man I now recognized as Victor Hargrove. The timestamp read March 15th. 2 years ago. 2 years. They had been circling my home like vultures for 2 full years before I noticed the shadow of a single wing. The second file was a screenshot of an email chain between Jordan, Price, SQ, and V. Hargrove, Dev, captured from Jordan's laptop during what must have been one of his Sunday visits when he left the machine open while helping Sophie with her shoes. The subject line read, Whitfield Property, Phase 1 Timeline. The emails discussed a staged approach. First, establish trust. Second, secure power of attorney. Third, file the deed under an LLC shell. Fourth, initiate guardianship proceedings to neutralize resistance. The language was clinical, devoid of any acknowledgement that they were discussing a human being's home and life. I was referred to throughout as the subject. The third file was a voice memo, recorded on Doris's phone. The quality was poor, muffled by fabric, likely captured with the device hidden in a pocket or purse. Jordan's voice was unmistakable, speaking to someone on the phone in our guest bathroom during a family dinner. He will sign anything Natalie puts in front of him. The old man trusts her completely. Once the POA is in place, we move to phase 2. Hargrove wants the demolition permitted by spring. Spring. He had said that 2 years ago. The timeline had slipped, delayed by something I now understood was Doris's quiet resistance. She had been the sand in their gears without them ever knowing. The fourth file broke me. It was a video, short and shaky, filmed on Doris's phone in what I recognized as our bedroom. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, the lamp on her nightstand casting a warm circle around her face. She looked directly into the camera with eyes that were clear, focused, and full of a grief that I recognized now as the knowledge of what was coming for her mind. Raymond, if you are watching this, then I have forgotten how to tell you in person. She paused, pressing her lips together. I found things. About Jordan. About what he is planning for our house. I have been trying to keep track. But the words, they keep slipping. Some days I write notes, and the next morning I cannot remember writing them. So I am putting everything here. In the clock. Because you always said a good timepiece keeps its secrets until the right moment. Her voice trembled but held steady. Protect Sophie. Raymond. Whatever Natalie has done, she did not start this. But Sophie is innocent. She is the only clean gear left in this family. Do not let them use her. The video ended. 43 seconds of my wife's voice, preserved like an insect in amber, speaking from a mind that was already beginning to dissolve at its edges. I pressed my palms against the workbench and bowed my head as something inside my chest finally gave way. I wept. For the first time since her funeral, I wept without restraint in the dark of my workshop, surrounded by the tools and oils and brass fittings that had been my refuge from grief for 3 years. I wept for the woman who saw the danger and could not make her mouth form the words to warn me. I wept for the months she must have spent alone with that knowledge, feeling it slip through her fingers like water through a broken cup. And I wept for the version of myself who had been so consumed by watching her disappear that I failed to see what she was trying to show me. Have you ever received a message from someone who can no longer speak? It arrives with a weight that no living voice can carry, because it comes from a place beyond correction, beyond clarification, beyond the possibility of asking, "What did you mean?" The workshop clock read 4:30 in the morning when the tears finally stopped. I washed my face at the utility sink, the cold water sharp against my swollen eyes, and stood straight. The man who emerged from that moment was not the same man who had walked in. The grief was still there, coiled in my chest like a mainspring wound to its limit. But it had been joined by something harder, something that Doris herself had placed inside me with her final lucid act. She had given me more than evidence. She had given me certainty, the absolute, unshakable knowledge that I was not overreacting, not misreading the situation, not being a paranoid old man. My wife had seen it clearly with a mind that was failing her, and she had still found the strength to build a lifeline for the day I would finally open my eyes. I looked at the 4 files on my screen one last time. Then I copied them to the live stream server alongside the recordings from yesterday. Tomorrow morning, the Preservation Board and the FBI they would see that this conspiracy had been documented by a dying woman 2 years before anyone else noticed the cracks. 5 hours. 5 hours until Jordan and Hargrove walked through my front door, expecting to find a confused old man ready to surrender his legacy. Instead, they would find a stage that Doris helped me build from beyond the reach of her own memory. I turned off the workshop light and walked toward the house, the October pre-dawn air cold and sharp against my lungs. The jasmine was dormant now, its vines bare in the darkness, but the roots were deep, and they remembered everything the leaves had forgotten. Friday morning arrived with the stillness of a courtroom before the verdict is read. I opened my eyes at 6:12, having slept for exactly 90 minutes on the workshop cot. A shallow unconsciousness that my body accepted out of necessity rather than surrender. The October light crept through the workshop windows in thin gray lines, illuminating the dust motes floating above my workbench like particles suspended in amber. I rose, splashed water on my face from the utility sink, and looked at my reflection in the small mirror above the basin. The man staring back at me had aged a decade in 5 days. The lines around his eyes were deeper, carved by grief and sleeplessness into something that resembled the case of a watch worn thin by years of opening and closing. But the eyes themselves were steady, clear, calibrated. I walked to the house and followed a routine I had rehearsed in my mind during those 90 minutes of shallow sleep. Shower. Shave. The white cotton shirt Doris always pressed for me on important days, the one she said made me look like a man who knows his worth. Gray wool trousers. The leather belt, with the brass buckle she gave me for our 25th anniversary. I dressed for her as much as for myself. Each garment a small act of remembrance that steadied my hands and slowed my pulse. Coffee. 1 cup. Black. Strong enough to strip varnish. I drank it standing at the kitchen window, watching the garden emerge from the pre-dawn shadows. The jasmine vines were bare wire against the fence, but the camellias along the south wall were beginning to set their winter buds, small green promises sealed tight against the coming cold. Doris planted those camellias the year Sophie was born. They bloom in January. They would bloom again this year because I intended to still be standing in this kitchen to see them. At 7:45, I entered the living room and activated the streaming system from a small remote control disguised as a universal television remote. The green indicator light on the receiver blinked twice, confirming connection to the Preservation Hall conference room. I checked the angles on my phone, viewing the 3 camera feeds in a split-screen display. The living room was visible from every corner: the sofa, the coffee table, the armchair where I would sit, and on the mantel, Doris's anniversary clock ticking in its walnut case, positioned directly in the center frame of camera 2. I placed the clock there deliberately. It was not evidence in a legal sense. It was something more personal. I wanted Doris present in the room when the truth was finally spoken aloud. I wanted her ticking away the seconds as the men who tried to steal her home were forced to confess it in front of witnesses. At 8:20, my phone rang. Natalie. Her name on the screen made my chest tighten with the complex ache of a father who loves his daughter and despises what she has allowed herself to become. Dad. Her voice was thin, a wire stretched to its breaking point. Are you home today? Jordan said he is coming by this morning for the paperwork. He wants me to be there too. I kept my voice warm, measured. The steady tone of a man who suspects nothing. I know, sweetheart. He mentioned it Sunday. But listen to me carefully. Take Sophie to school first. Use the interior courtyard entrance, not the Rutledge gate. Then come to the house. Can you be here by 10? A pause. The sound of her breathing, quick and shallow. The same rhythm I had heard through the smart home monitors on Tuesday. Dad, is everything okay? You sound different. I am fine, Natalie. I let a small laugh escape, the kind an old man makes when his daughter fusses. Just want to make sure Sophie gets to school on time. You know how she dawdles at breakfast. She agreed. I heard the click of the call ending and stood in the silence of my living room, the 3 cameras recording my stillness for an audience that was already assembling 7 blocks away in the conference room at Preservation Hall. At 9:05, I received a text from Connie Bellamy. 3 words. Board is seated. I imagined them, 14 members of the Charleston Historic Preservation Board arranged around the long mahogany table, the secure monitor at the far end of the room displaying my empty living room in high definition. Agent Dawson in his blue windbreaker, seated against the back wall. Connie herself, watching from a position of authority she had waited 3 years to occupy. I placed my phone face down on the side table and sat in my armchair. The clock on the mantel ticked. The house was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the barely perceptible whisper of the live stream transmitting through the walls. I folded my hands in my lap and waited. At 9:37, I heard it. The crunch of tires on the oyster shell driveway. 2 vehicles. Jordan's BMW first, its engine carrying the aggressive purr of a man in a hurry. Then a second vehicle, heavier, the smooth rumble of a Mercedes sedan. Victor Hargrove. I stood up, smoothed my shirt, and walked to the front door. Through the sidelight glass, I watched them emerge. Jordan in his pressed navy suit, briefcase in hand, his jaw set with the manufactured confidence of a man who believes today is the day he wins everything. Hargrove behind him, cashmere overcoat draped over his shoulders despite the mild October morning, his silver hair combed back with the precision of a man accustomed to being photographed. They walked up the garden path together, past the camellias Doris planted, past the wrought iron gate my great-grandfather forged, past 130 years of history they intended to reduce to rubble by Christmas. Both smiling, both certain they were walking into the home of a confused old man who would sign whatever they placed in front of him. I opened the door with a smile that matched theirs, steady and warm and entirely constructed. Gentlemen, right on time. I stepped aside to welcome them in. Please, make yourselves comfortable. Coffee is already on. They crossed my threshold without a second thought. And 7 blocks away, 14 faces watched them do it. Jordan settled into my sofa with the ease of a man who has already mentally redecorated the room. He placed his briefcase on the coffee table, the brass clasps catching the morning light as he snapped them open with practiced efficiency. Hargrove took the wingback chair nearest the fireplace, crossing his legs with the casual authority of someone accustomed to sitting at the head of every table. He accepted the coffee I offered without thanks, his eyes sweeping the room with the appraising gaze of a demolition foreman measuring load-bearing walls. I sat in my armchair, directly in the sightline of camera 1, and folded my hands in my lap. The clock on the mantel ticked between us, its rhythm steady and patient. Doris was watching. Jordan wasted no time. He withdrew a thick folder from his briefcase and spread 3 documents across the coffee table with the flourish of a poker player, revealing a winning hand. Ray, I have been working with a colleague on updating your estate planning. He used the warm, patronizing tone he reserved for conversations he believed I was too old to fully comprehend. Given your age and the complexity of maintaining a property like this, we think it is best to consolidate everything under a single management structure. He slid the first document toward me. It was labeled Healthcare and Property Directive Update. But even without reading past the first paragraph, I recognized the embedded language of a full asset transfer, the same mechanism he had used before with the forged power of attorney, hiding the blade inside the bandage. Hargrove sipped his coffee and watched me with the flat patience of a predator who has seen this play performed many times before. He did not bother to maintain the pretense Jordan was constructing. After 3 minutes of Jordan's careful explanation of benefits and protections, Hargrove simply interrupted. Let us not waste the man's morning, Jordan. He set his cup on the side table and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. Mr. Whitfield, I am Victor Hargrove. I run a development firm. Your son-in-law has been working with me on a project that involves this property. The paperwork in front of you transfers ownership to a holding company that I control. Once signed, you will receive a settlement of $200,000 and relocation assistance to a very comfortable assisted living community in Mount Pleasant. The audacity of it stole the air from the room. He was not even pretending anymore. He sat in my home, drank my coffee, and told me to my face that he intended to buy my family's history for a fraction of its value and demolish it for profit. Jordan shifted uncomfortably on the sofa. Victor, we discussed the approach. He is more likely to cooperate if we frame it as a health decision. Hargrove waved him off with the dismissive gesture of a man who has grown tired of diplomacy. He is 62, Jordan, not 90. He can hear me just fine. He turned those flat eyes back to me. Can you not, Mr. Whitfield? I held his gaze without blinking. I can hear you perfectly, Mr. Hargrove. Good. Hargrove reached into his own coat pocket and produced a single sheet of paper, placing it atop Jordan's carefully arranged documents. Then, you also understand that this is not a negotiation. Your son-in-law owes me a significant debt, and this property is how that debt gets settled. Sign the papers today, and everyone walks away comfortable, including your granddaughter." The room went still. The word granddaughter landed on the coffee table like a stone dropped into glass. Jordan's jaw tightened. He knew Hargrove had crossed a line that made the legal theater irrelevant. I let the silence stretch for 3 full seconds. 1, 2, 3. Each tick of Doris's clock, measuring the space between their confidence and their ruin. "What does my granddaughter have to do with a property transfer, Mr. Hargrove?" I asked, my voice carrying the quiet steadiness of a man who already knows the answer. Hargrove smiled. It was a thin expression that never reached his eyes. "She has a lovely routine at Ashley Hall. 3:15 every afternoon at the Rutledge Gate. My associate Marcus has been keeping an eye on things. Purely as a courtesy, of course, to make sure she is safe while these negotiations conclude." There it was, spoken aloud, in my living room, in front of 3 hidden cameras, broadcasting to 14 members of the Historic Preservation Board, 1 FBI field agent, and 1 retired circuit court judge who had been waiting 6 years for this man to speak his crimes into a microphone. Jordan leaned forward. "Ray, just sign the papers, please." His voice had lost all its courtroom polish. It was the voice of a drowning man reaching for anything solid. "This will all be over in 10 minutes. I looked at Jordan. Then I looked at Hargrove. Then I looked at the clock on the mantel, its walnut case warm in the morning light, its hands pointing to 9:53, 7 blocks away. I knew exactly what was happening in that conference room. I knew the expressions on those 14 faces. I knew Agent Dawson was already reaching for his phone. I smiled. Not the confused smile of an old man who does not understand what is happening. The smile of a watchmaker who has just heard every gear in a complex mechanism click into its final position. "Gentlemen." I reached for the television remote on the side table, the same device that controlled the live stream. "I would like you to meet your audience." I pressed the button. The 65-inch screen above the fireplace illuminated with a sharp blue-white glow, and suddenly my living room was no longer a private space. It was a stage. On the screen, displayed in crisp high definition, sat 14 members of the Charleston Historic Preservation Board arranged around their conference table. Their faces were turned toward their own monitor, watching. In the back corner of the frame, a man in a navy blue FBI windbreaker was already standing, his phone pressed to his ear. The color drained from Jordan's face in a wave that started at his hairline and ended at his collar. His mouth opened, but produced no sound. The briefcase on the coffee table suddenly looked like an exhibit tag waiting to be numbered. Hargrove's reaction was slower, more controlled. The measured processing of a man who has faced adversity before, but I watched his pupils dilate as the reality settled in. His fingers tightening on the arm of my wingback chair until the leather creaked under the pressure. "Every word you have spoken in this room has been broadcast live to the Charleston Historic Preservation Board and witnessed by a federal agent." I stood up, my voice carrying the weight of 72 hours of planning and 31 years of protecting this home. This property was granted emergency historic designation on Wednesday. No sale, no transfer, and no demolition can proceed. And your threat against my granddaughter was heard by everyone in that room. The clock on the mantel struck 10. And somewhere on Meeting Street, I heard the sound of a door being locked from the inside. The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. I know because Doris's clock counted each one with the faithful precision of a mechanism that has never missed a beat in 31 years. 4 seconds of absolute stillness, in which 2 men watched their futures dissolve on a 65-inch screen mounted above a fireplace built by hands that knew what freedom meant. Jordan moved first. He stood from the sofa in a jerky, uncoordinated motion that knocked his briefcase off the coffee table, sending the forged documents scattering across the heart pine floor like dead leaves. His face had gone the color of old parchment, his mouth working soundlessly as his eyes darted between the screen and the front door, calculating distances his legs were too frozen to cover. "This is illegal." His voice emerged as a croak, stripped of every ounce of courtroom authority he had cultivated over 15 years of practice. "You cannot record a private conversation without consent. This is wiretapping." "None of this is admissible." I did not respond. I simply stood by the mantel, with my hand resting beside Doris's clock, and waited. Because the answer to Jordan's objection was not mine to give. On the screen, a figure moved from the back row of the conference room toward the camera. Judge Constance Bellamy, 76 years old, retired circuit court, her silver hair catching the fluorescent light as she leaned toward the microphone on the conference table. Her voice filled my living room with the resonance of a gavel striking oak. "Mr. Price, South Carolina Code Section 17-30-30. This is a one-party consent state. Mr. Whitfield is the consenting party, and these recordings were made on his own property. Furthermore," she paused, adjusting her glasses with the deliberate precision of a woman who has delivered verdicts to far more dangerous men than Jordan Price, "I authorized a judicial monitoring warrant for Victor Hargrove's activities 3 days ago under seal. Every transmission from this residence has been collected under lawful authority. Your objection is noted and overruled." The word "overruled" landed in the room like a physical blow. Jordan's knees buckled slightly, his hand reaching for the arm of the sofa to steady himself. On the screen behind Connie, Agent Dawson was already moving toward the conference room door, his phone pressed to his ear, his mouth forming words that I knew were setting wheels in motion across Charleston. Hargrove had not moved from the wingback chair. His stillness was different from Jordan's paralysis. It was the calculated immobility of a predator reassessing the terrain, looking for the angle that might still exist. His eyes moved from the screen to me with a cold, evaluative focus that reminded me of the way he had looked at my house, measuring it for demolition. "You think this changes anything, Whitfield?" His voice was low, controlled, carrying the last reserves of a man who has talked his way out of corners before. "I have lawyers who will tie this up for years. You will spend every dollar you have fighting me in court, and by the time it is resolved, you will be too old to enjoy this house anyway." I reached for my phone and pressed play on the file I had queued before they arrived. The speakers mounted in the ceiling filled the room with a recording from yesterday afternoon. Hargrove's own voice, captured by my smart home system, echoed back at him from the walls of my living room. "That house has been standing since 1890. By January, it will be a parking garage, and your father-in-law will be signing whatever we put in front of him from a bed in Magnolia Memory Care." Hargrove's composure cracked. A vein in his temple pulsed visibly as his own words were played back to him in front of a federal audience. I followed it immediately, with the recording of his threat about Marcus Webb and Sophie. "That asset remains active until I say otherwise." Then I played Doris's evidence. The photograph of Jordan accepting the envelope in my driveway 2 years ago. The email chain labeled Whitfield Property Phase 1 Timeline. The voice memo of Jordan promising that the old man trusts Natalie completely. Each piece of evidence dropped into the room like a stone into still water, the ripples spreading outward until there was nowhere left for either man to stand on dry ground. Jordan had collapsed onto the sofa, his head in his hands, the forged deeds scattered beneath his feet, like the confetti of a celebration that would never happen. Hargrove remained in the wingback chair, his jaw locked, his eyes fixed on the screen where 14 faces stared back at him with expressions ranging from disgust to cold fury. Then Hargrove moved. It was sudden, explosive. The burst of a man who has decided that if the walls are closing in, he will go through them rather than submit. He launched himself from the chair toward the television, his arms swinging in a wide arc aimed at the screen. Whether he intended to destroy the evidence or simply to silence the faces judging him, I never learned, because the front door of my house opened before his hand reached the glass. 2 Charleston police officers entered first, followed by a plainclothes detective I recognized as Reeves from my Thursday phone call. Behind them, filling the doorframe with the quiet authority of a man who has waited 18 months for this moment, stood FBI Special Agent Dawson. His badge was visible on a lanyard around his neck, and his expression carried the clinical focus of someone executing a carefully planned operation. Victor Hargrove. Agent Dawson's voice was calm, professional, and absolute. You are under arrest for racketeering, fraud, bribery, and conspiracy to commit elder abuse. You have the right to remain silent. Hargrove's arm dropped to his side. The fight drained from his body in a visible wave, his shoulders slumping as Officer Reeves guided his wrists behind his back. The metallic click of the handcuffs was the sharpest sound in the room, a precise mechanical finality that echoed against the heart pine walls my great-grandfather had raised with freed hands. Jordan did not resist when the second officer approached. He simply extended his wrists with the hollow compliance of a man who has been expecting this ending longer than he would ever admit. As they cuffed him, he looked up at me from the sofa, his eyes red-rimmed and searching. How long have you known? His voice was barely audible. I looked down at him, feeling no satisfaction, only the heavy exhaustion of a war that should never have been fought inside these walls. Since Sunday. Jordan, since you put a clock on my workbench and thought I would not look inside. They led him toward the door. As Jordan crossed the threshold, his polished shoes scraping against the same floorboards his grandmother-in-law once danced across, he turned back. You have destroyed Natalie's life. The words were meant as a weapon, but they arrived empty, drained of all force, by the evidence still playing on the screen behind me. I held his gaze without flinching. No, Jordan. You did that the moment you put a price tag on Sophie's safety. Everything after that was just the clock running down. The door closed behind them. The living room fell silent except for the steady ticking of Doris's clock on the mantel and the distant sound of a police radio crackling from the driveway. I stood alone in my house, surrounded by scattered documents and empty coffee cups, feeling the weight of 72 hours finally begin to lift from my shoulders. Then I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. A silver Honda. Natalie. I watched her through the sidelight glass. She sat in the driver's seat for a long time, both hands gripping the steering wheel, her eyes fixed on the police cruiser that was pulling away from the curb with Jordan's silhouette visible through the rear window. I could not see her face clearly from this distance, but the rigid set of her shoulders told me everything. She had known this morning was not about paperwork. Some part of her had always known. Natalie stepped out of the Honda slowly. The way a person exits a vehicle when they are not certain the ground beneath them is solid. She wore the blue cardigan I gave her last Christmas, the same one she always twisted in her fingers when the anxiety became too heavy to hide. Her eyes moved from the empty driveway, where Jordan's BMW had been, to the front porch, where I now stood with my hands at my sides. She looked smaller than I remembered. Thinner. The circles beneath her eyes spoke of weeks without real sleep. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. The distance between us was 6 feet, maybe 7. It might as well have been the width of the Cooper River. Dad. Her voice cracked on the single syllable, splitting it into 2 broken halves. What happened? Where is Jordan? I held the screen door open. Come inside, Natalie. We need to talk. She climbed the steps with the hesitant gait of a woman approaching a verdict she has spent months dreading. Inside, the living room still carried the evidence of the morning's confrontation. The scattered documents on the floor. The empty coffee cups. The television, now dark, still mounted above the fireplace where 14 faces had watched her husband confess. I did not clean it. I wanted her to see the aftermath. The way a surgeon wants a patient to see the X-ray before discussing treatment. Natalie stood in the center of the room, her arms wrapped around herself, her eyes scanning the papers on the floor, with a recognition that confirmed what I already suspected. She had seen these documents before. She knew what they contained. How much did you know, Natalie? I asked the question without anger, without accusation. I asked it the way an engineer asks where the failure point originated, not to assign blame, but to understand the full scope of the damage. She did not answer immediately. Her fingers found the hem of her cardigan and began their familiar twisting. A self-soothing mechanism I recognized from her childhood. From the nights she could not sleep and would find me in the workshop, pulling at her pajama sleeve while asking me to explain how the clocks worked. The gesture broke my heart in a way that Jordan's betrayal never could. I knew about the deed. Her voice was barely audible, directed at the floor. He told me it was a business arrangement, that we would sell the house and split the money and you would be comfortable somewhere nice. He said it was what Mom would have wanted, that maintaining this place was too much for you alone. And the power of attorney? I asked. She closed her eyes. He said it was a health directive, that it was standard, that you had agreed to it at the lunch. Her eyes opened, wet and red. I believed him, Dad. I wanted to believe him because he made it sound like we were helping you. I let the silence hold for a moment. The clock on the mantel filled the space with its patient rhythm. Then I asked the question that mattered more than any document or recording. Did you know about Sophie? Her head snapped up. The reaction was immediate, visceral, a physical recoil that told me everything before her mouth could form the words. Her face drained to a white, so complete it looked like the blood had been pulled from her body by force. What about Sophie? Her voice was a whisper that sounded like tearing paper. What do you mean? What about Sophie? I told her. I told her about Marcus Webb at the school gate, about the photographs, the Rutledge Avenue window, the 3:15 schedule. I told her that Jordan had provided her daughter's exact location and routine to a man employed by Victor Hargrove as a pressure tool. I told her that a stranger had been waving at her child through a fence for 3 days. I did not soften it. I did not cushion the impact. She needed to feel the full weight of what her compliance had enabled. Natalie collapsed. Not dramatically, not the way people fall in movies. She simply folded, her knees giving way until she was sitting on the floor of my living room, surrounded by the scattered evidence of her husband's crimes, her hands covering her mouth as a sound emerged from her chest that I had not heard since her mother's funeral. A keening. Low and continuous, and completely without hope. I did not move to comfort her. I could not. Not yet. The distance between us was earned, and it would take more than tears to bridge it. When the sound finally subsided into ragged breathing, I spoke again. My voice was level, precise, calibrated to convey that what I was offering was not negotiable. You have one choice, Natalie. One. I waited until her eyes found mine. You cooperate fully with the FBI. You file for emergency divorce. You petition for sole custody of Sophie. And you testify against Jordan and Hargrove in exchange for immunity from prosecution. That is the path that keeps Sophie in your life. I paused, letting the alternative hang in the air unspoken. She understood. The evidence on the floor included her signature on documents she knew were fraudulent. Without cooperation, she was an accomplice. With it, she was a witness. She nodded. A small, broken movement that cost her everything she had left. I will do it. Whatever it takes. Sophie stays with me. I reached into my jacket and produced the cooperation agreement Connie Bellamy had drafted on Wednesday. I placed it on the coffee table beside Jordan's scattered forgeries. Natalie crawled to her knees, pulled herself up using the sofa arm, and signed it with a pen that trembled so violently the signature was barely legible. But it was hers. Authentic. The first honest mark she had put on paper in months. As she set the pen down, she looked up at me with eyes that held 20 years of childhood trust and 6 months of adult failure in equal measure. Did Mom know? I looked at the clock on the mantel. Doris's clock. 31 years of keeping perfect time. 31 years of holding secrets in its hidden compartment, waiting for the proper moment to release them. I nodded once. Natalie pressed her hand against her mouth and closed her eyes. The sound she made was not a sob. It was something quieter. Something that sounded like a door, closing on the person she used to be. She stood, smoothed her cardigan with shaking hands, and walked toward the front door. At the threshold, she paused without turning around. "I will earn it back, Dad." She spoke to the October air, her voice carrying the thin, determined quality of a woman who has just hit the bottom and found it solid enough to push against. "Every piece of trust I broke, I will earn it back." I did not offer a hug. I did not offer forgiveness. Some things cannot be given. They can only be built, slowly, with steady hands and honest materials. "Goodbye, Natalie. Drive safe." I watched her walk to the Honda, her frame small against the wide piazza and the ancient oaks. She drove away without looking back, and I stood in my doorway, the weight of the morning finally settling into my bones, looking at the clock on the mantel through the open living room door. Its hands pointed to 10:47. The longest morning of my life was over, but the repairs had only just begun. The week that followed the arrest moved with the slow, grinding precision of a clock that has been overwound and needs time to find its natural rhythm again. I spent most of it in my workshop, not repairing timepieces, but organizing the aftermath of a war I never wanted to fight. Connie Bellamy called daily with updates delivered in the clipped, efficient cadence of a woman who had spent 3 decades managing the machinery of justice. Jordan Price was formally disbarred by the South Carolina Bar Association on the following Wednesday. The emergency hearing lasted 47 minutes. The evidence was described as overwhelming and unprecedented in its clarity. His license was not suspended pending review. It was revoked. Permanently. The distinction mattered. Suspension implies the possibility of return. Revocation means the door is welded shut. The criminal charges followed within days. Fraud, forgery, conspiracy to commit elder abuse, identity theft, and the charge that carried the heaviest weight in the eyes of the court, child endangerment. Jordan's decision to provide Sophie's school schedule to Marcus Webb transformed what might have been a white-collar financial case into something far darker, something that ensured no judge in Charleston County would consider bail a reasonable option. Victor Hargrove's reckoning came from a higher authority. The FBI field office in North Charleston executed a coordinated operation the Monday after the arrest, raiding Hargrove Development's offices on Calhoun Street and seizing 18 months of financial records that Agent Dawson had been building a case around since long before I entered the picture. My evidence, Doris's evidence, was described by Dawson in a brief phone call as the keystone that completed the arch. Hargrove was indicted on federal charges of racketeering, bribery of public officials, wire fraud, and conspiracy. The demolition clause in my property agreement was cited as one of 7 similar patterns across the Charleston Peninsula. My house was not his first target, but because of Doris, it would be his last. Marcus Webb was arrested at a motel on the outskirts of Somerville 3 days after the raid. Identified through the Georgia plates I had photographed and the stalking report Detective Reeves had filed. The charges included criminal conspiracy, intimidation of a minor, and violation of a temporary restraining order. He did not make bail. The Historic Preservation Board issued its formal designation on October 30th. I stood in the conference room at Preservation Hall as Thomas Gayard read the resolution aloud. The property at 14 Lager Street was officially recognized as a site of significant cultural and architectural heritage, protected under Charleston Municipal Code from demolition, unauthorized alteration, or transfer without full board review, and a 90-day public comment period. The resolution cited the house's construction in 1890 by a freedman craftsman, its continuous family ownership across 4 generations, and its architectural integrity as one of the last unaltered Charleston singles of its period. I signed the acceptance documents with a fountain pen that Doris had given me for our 20th anniversary. The ink was the same shade of blue-black she always preferred. I thought she would have appreciated the symmetry. On the first Tuesday of November, I sat in Connie Bellamy's library one last time in an official capacity. The smell of Earl Grey and lemon oil had become as familiar as my own workshop. We finalized the irrevocable spendthrift trust I had established for Sophie. naming a corporate trustee to manage the funds, and removing all discretionary access from both Natalie and Jordan permanently. The trust covered education through graduate school, healthcare, and a modest living stipend beginning at age 25. Sophie's future was sealed inside a legal structure, as solid as the walls of the house it was designed to protect. For Natalie, I established a conditional arrangement that Connie described with her characteristic precision as generous, given the circumstances. A monthly stipend sufficient for rent and basic expenses in Charleston, contingent on 3 non-negotiable conditions. First, maintenance of a permanent restraining order against Jordan Price. Second, completion of a court-ordered financial literacy and accountability program. Third, demonstrated employment within 90 days. If any condition was violated, the stipend terminated immediately and without appeal. It was not forgiveness. It was architecture. A narrow corridor with walls on both sides, leading towards something that might eventually resemble rebuilding. But the door at the end was hers to open, not mine. Natalie's text arrived on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after the arrest. I was at my workbench, adjusting the balance wheel on a 1912 Patek Philippe, when my phone illuminated with 3 words. Divorce is final. I set down my loupe and looked at the wall where the workshop clock ticked with its usual indifference to human drama. Full custody had been granted to Natalie without contest. Jordan's parental rights were suspended pending criminal proceedings, and the court had appointed a guardian ad litem to represent Sophie's interests independently of either parent. The system was functioning exactly as it was designed to function, slow, methodical, and absolute. I picked up my loupe and returned to the Patek Philippe. The balance wheel needed 3 more adjustments before it would keep proper time. Precision work, the kind that requires steady hands and a mind free from distraction. 2 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon when the first real chill of November had turned the garden brittle and silver with frost, Sophie sat on her stool in my workshop, watching me polish a crystal. She had been quieter than usual all morning, her small hands folded in her lap instead of reaching for tools or asking questions. I recognized the posture. It was the stillness of a child who is assembling a question too large for her vocabulary. She finally spoke at 3:12. Her voice small but clear against the ticking of the workshop clock. "Grandpa, can a broken clock still tell the right time?" My hand stopped moving on the crystal. I set down the polishing cloth and turned to face her fully, giving the question the weight it deserved. She was not asking about clocks. She was 5 years old, and she was asking about her family. I looked at her face, at the serious brown eyes that carried so much of Doris in their depth, and I gave her the only honest answer I had. "Twice a day, Sophie. A broken clock is still right twice a day. But if you learn how to fix it, it can be right. All the time." She considered this with the focused gravity of a child processing something beyond her years. Then she nodded, climbed off her stool, and reached for the small practice movement I kept on the lower shelf for her visits. "Will you teach me how to fix it, Grandpa?" I placed my calloused hand over her small fingers and guided them toward the first gear. "That is exactly what we are going to do." November turned to December, and the Charleston winter settled over Lagar Street with its gentle, damp persistence. Not the brutal cold of northern states, but a quiet chill that crept into the bones of old houses and made the heart pine floors creak with a different voice than they carried in summer. My workshop became a sanctuary again, no longer a command center or a listening post, but simply the place where broken things came to be made whole. Sophie arrived every Sunday at 10 in the morning, delivered by Natalie, who would park in the driveway and walk her daughter to the garden gate, before retreating to the kitchen where she waited in a silence that was no longer hostile, but not yet comfortable. Our routine established itself with the natural precision of a well-maintained movement. Sophie would climb onto her stool, pull on the child-sized leather apron I had sewn for her from an old jacket of Doris's, and ask the same question every week. "What are we fixing today, Grandpa?" The project I chose for her was a 1920s Elgin pocket watch, a simple mechanism with large enough components for small fingers to manipulate yet complex enough to teach the fundamental principles of how time is organized. The case was tarnished silver. The crystal cracked. The mainspring fatigued from decades of neglect. It had been sitting in my parts drawer for years, waiting for a purpose I had not yet imagined. We began with disassembly. I taught her to lay each component on the felt tray in the exact order of removal, creating a map of the mechanism that would guide reassembly. She was patient in a way that surprised me, her small fingers handling the tweezers with a concentration that furrowed her brow into an expression I recognized as pure Doris. She did not rush. She did not force. When a screw resisted, she asked rather than pushed, "Grandpa, this one does not want to come out." She held the movement steady, her tongue pressed against her upper lip. "Then we need to understand why it is resisting before we try harder." I guided her hand to feel the angle. Sometimes a gear is not stuck. It is just waiting for the right approach. She considered this with the seriousness of a surgeon. Then she adjusted her angle by 2 degrees, and the screw released cleanly. She looked up at me with a triumph that lit the workshop brighter than the jeweler's lamp. "I found the right approach, Grandpa." "You did, Sophie. You listened to what it was telling you." Between the mechanical lessons, she talked. The way children talk when their hands are occupied and their minds feel safe. She told me about school, about her friend Charlotte who could hang upside down on the monkey bars, about the art teacher who let her use the grown-up paintbrushes, and sometimes, between the safe topics, she would drop a small stone of truth into the conversation without looking up from her work. "Mommy cries at night sometimes. She thinks I am asleep, but I hear her through the wall." I set down my loop and gave the statement the space it required. "What do you do when you hear her?" Sophie's fingers paused on the balance wheel. "I hold my stuffed rabbit tighter and tell him everything will be okay. Then in the morning Mommy makes pancakes and smiles, so I think maybe the rabbit helps." I reached over and placed my hand on hers, the calluses of my palm meeting the impossible softness of her skin. "Maybe it does, sweetheart. Sometimes knowing someone is listening is enough to make the gears start turning again." She nodded, satisfied with this answer, and returned to the balance wheel, with the focus of a craftsman who understands that attention is its own form of love. Natalie's transformation happened in increments so small they were nearly invisible, the way a clock's minute hand appears motionless until you look away and look back. She found work at a small bookshop on King Street, a position that paid modestly but allowed her to walk Sophie to school in the mornings before her shift. She enrolled in the court-ordered financial literacy program without complaint, attending Tuesday and Thursday evening sessions at the community center while a neighbor watched Sophie. She maintained the restraining order, renewed it without prompting, and never once mentioned Jordan's name in my presence. On the 4th Sunday in December, as Sophie worked on cleaning the Elgin's dial with a soft brush I had given her, I noticed something on my banking app that made me pause. The monthly stipend I deposited for Natalie was $400, but her account showed a recurring transfer of $200 into a savings account titled Whitfield Repayment Fund. She was returning half of every payment I gave her, building a quiet ledger of accountability that no one had asked her to create. I stared at the screen for a long time. It was not the money that moved me. It was the discipline of it. The consistency, week after week. Half of her survival going back toward a debt she could never fully repay but refused to ignore. It was the behavior of a woman who understood that trust is not rebuilt with words, but with the accumulation of small, faithful actions over time. I did not mention it to her. Some repairs work best when no one is watching. The pocket watch took 6 Sundays to complete. 6 sessions of careful disassembly, cleaning, lubrication, and reassembly. Each one teaching Sophie a different principle. The mainspring taught her about stored energy. The gear train taught her about ratio and transfer. The escapement taught her about regulation, about the importance of letting things move at their natural pace rather than forcing them faster. And the balance wheel taught her the most important lesson of all, that the heart of any mechanism is the part that swings back and forth between 2 extremes and finds its center through repetition. On the 6th Sunday, Sophie placed the final screw, sealed the case back with a gentle press of her thumbs, and wound the crown with 3 careful turns. The ticking that emerged was clean, steady, and true. A rhythm born from patience and small hands guided by larger ones. She held up the watch, her eyes wide. The tarnished silver, catching the winter light from the workshop window. "It works, Grandpa." I fixed it. I placed my calloused hand over her small fingers, feeling the pulse of the mechanism vibrating through both our skins. The same vibration that has passed through my hands for 40 years, now reaching hers for the first time. "You did, Sophie. Sometimes the smallest hands do the most important work." She held the watch to her ear and closed her eyes, listening to the ticking with an expression of pure, uncomplicated wonder. The sound of something broken made whole again, kept in time by a child who was learning that damage is not destiny. On a Wednesday evening in late January, with the Charleston frost thick on the garden path and the workshop radiator ticking with its own mechanical warmth, I sat at my bench and recorded a message. The small USB drive was no larger than a house key, matte black and featureless, designed to endure decades in a sealed container without degradation. I held it in my palm and looked at the tiny red recording light on my laptop camera, and I spoke to a version of Sophie who does not yet exist. The 18-year-old girl who will one day need to understand why her grandfather did what he did. I told her about the house, about her great-great-grandfather who laid the bricks with hands that remembered chains, about Doris, who saw the danger and hid the evidence in a place only love would think to look. I told her about her mother, about the difference between weakness and wickedness, and about how Natalie chose her when the choice cost everything else. I told her about Jordan without cruelty, but without softening. A child deserves the truth when she is old enough to carry it. And I told her about the clocks, about how every mechanism, no matter how complex, operates on the same principle. Energy stored, energy regulated, energy released in measured increments that give the chaos of existence a rhythm we can trust. I told her that the people who understand this principle, who learn to listen for the sound of a gear that is misaligned before the whole movement ceases, those people become the ones who keep the world running on time. I ended the recording with the same words engraved on my pocket watch. The words Sophie has been reciting since she was 3 years old, pressing her small finger against the brass each Sunday before we begin our work. All things in their proper time. I saved the file, encrypted it with a key phrase only Sophie would know, her grandmother's middle name followed by the year of the house, and sealed the USB inside a small brass capsule I had machined specifically for this purpose. The capsule fit perfectly inside the pocket watch case she had restored, nestled beside the movement in the space between the dust cover and the case back. She would not find it until she was old enough to perform a full service on the watch herself. By then, she would have the skills to open it and the maturity to understand what was inside. I closed the case back with a gentle press and placed the watch in a velvet-lined box on the shelf beside Doris's tools. Then I turned to my laptop and opened the Smart Home Administration panel for the last time. The monitoring system glowed on my screen with its familiar array of feeds and frequency indicators. 3 cameras in the living room, 2 microphones in the hallway, the encrypted bridge to my workshop terminal, the recording buffer that had captured every conversation in my house for the past 4 months. I looked at it the way a soldier looks at a weapon after the ceasefire, with respect for what it accomplished and relief that it is no longer needed. I selected all feeds. I chose the permanent deletion option, and I confirmed it without hesitation. The screen went dark. No more watching. No more listening. No more sitting in the shadows of my own home, cataloging the movements of people I am supposed to love. The fortress had served its purpose. Now it was time to let it become a house again. I walked through the garden to the back door, the cold January air sharp against my lungs, and entered the kitchen where the warmth of the heating system met me like an embrace. I carried Doris's anniversary clock from the workshop where it had sat since the night I opened its hidden compartment. I walked to the parlor and placed it back on the mantel, centered between our wedding photograph and her grandmother's candlestick. Its ticking filled the room immediately. a sound so familiar that its absence over these past weeks had been a silence I felt in my chest without being able to name. There. Back where you belong. The clock's hands read 8:14 on a Wednesday evening. It was keeping perfect time, as it always had, as it always would. The hidden compartment was empty now, its secret delivered, its purpose fulfilled. But the mechanism itself continued without pause, indifferent to the human drama it had witnessed, faithful only to the physics of its own design. Sunday came with a thin winter sun that turned the frost on the jasmine vines into a lattice of crystal. Natalie arrived at 10 with Sophie, who bounded through the garden gate with her leather apron already tied over her coat. My daughter paused at the gate, her hand resting on the wrought iron, her breath visible in the cold air. "I brought your favorite." She held up a small paper bag. "The almond croissants from the bakery on Broad Street. I left them on the counter." "Thank you, Natalie." I nodded from the piazza. "We will be in the workshop." She went inside without lingering, without asking to join us, without pushing against the boundaries I had established. The kitchen door closed softly behind her, and through the window I could see her sitting at the table with a book and a cup of tea she had brought from home. She did not use my kettle. She did not open my cabinets. Small courtesies that spoke of a woman learning the architecture of earned space rather than assumed belonging. In the workshop, Sophie pulled a new project from the shelf, a small carriage clock with a stuck striking mechanism that she had been studying from the outside for 2 weeks, building her diagnosis before requesting permission to open it. She was learning the discipline of observation before intervention, the principle that had saved my life and my home. "Grandpa, I think the hammer spring is bent." She pointed to the striking train through the glass panel. "It is not reaching the bell properly." I looked where she indicated and saw that she was exactly right. "How would you fix it?" She tilted her head, thinking. "I would remove the spring carefully, straighten it on the anvil with very small taps, and then test it before I put it back. Because if I bend it too far the other way, I have to start over." I handed her the screwdriver with a solemnity that felt like a ceremony. "Then show me." The workshop filled with the small, precise sounds of a child learning her grandfather's trade. Tapping, adjusting, testing. The patience of hands that understand the value of measure. Outside, the jasmine vines stood bare against the fence, their roots deep beneath the frozen soil, holding the memory of every summer bloom and every winter dormancy they had ever endured. I looked at the empty bracket on the wall, where the surveillance camera used to hang. Then I looked at Sophie, her tongue pressed against her lip in concentration, her hands steady on the spring. The best way to watch over someone is not with a lens. It is with a steady hand and enough patience to teach them how to watch over themselves. I turned back to my own bench, picked up a movement that needed cleaning, and let the afternoon pass, in the quiet companionship of shared work. No screens, no frequencies, no recordings. Just the sound of 2 clockmakers, separated by 57 years, keeping time together. I am standing on my piazza as the February sun drops behind the harbor, turning the water into a sheet of molten copper and the sky above the steeples into a bruise of violet and gold. The air carries the first false promise of spring, that brief Charleston warmth that arrives weeks before the real thing, teasing the jasmine into thinking it is time to bloom. The vines along the fence have not leafed yet, but I can see the buds forming at the joints, small green certainties preparing themselves for the season they know is coming. This house has stood for 135 years. It has survived hurricanes that bent the live oaks double and wars that turned neighbor against neighbor. It has held births and deaths and Sunday dinners and the quiet arguments of a marriage that lasted 3 decades. Its walls have absorbed laughter and grief in equal measure, and they carry both in the grain of the heart pine the way a clock carries time, not as a burden but as a purpose. I used to think that protecting my family meant providing for them, working, earning, building structures that would outlast me. But this house taught me something different. Protection is not a passive architecture. It is an active discipline, a daily calibration that requires the same attention I give to a movement that has drifted out of regulation. You must listen for the sound of a gear slipping before the whole mechanism seizes. You must watch for the hairline fracture in a foundation before the wall begins to lean. And when the damage is discovered, you must have the courage to perform the repair, even when the repair requires taking apart something you love. I believe the Lord places us in the exact position we need to be at the exact moment we need to be there. I did not understand why He took Doris from me 3 years before this storm arrived. I spent those years angry at the silence, at the empty chair, at the clock that kept ticking when the person who wounded it was gone. But now, I see the design. He gave her the clarity to see the danger before it reached our door. He gave her the strength to hide the evidence, even as her mind was failing. And He gave me the 3 years of solitude I needed to become the man who could hear what she was trying to tell me. His timing is not our timing, but it is always, always precise. My biggest mistake was not trusting my daughter. Trust is the currency of every family, and we spend it without counting, because we believe the supply is infinite. My mistake was silence. I saw the small cracks forming years before Jordan arrived. The way Natalie deferred to men who spoke with authority. I saw those hairline fractures and I said nothing. Because naming them felt like criticism. And criticism felt like failure, and failure felt like something a provider should never admit. So I stayed silent. And silence gave the rot permission to spread until the entire foundation was compromised. Do not be like me. Do not wait until the walls are leaning before you ask the hard questions about what is happening inside your own home. Do not mistake peace for health. A clock that has stopped is perfectly silent, but it is not keeping time. It is merely occupying space while pretending to serve a purpose it abandoned long ago. I believe the Lord gives every family a watchmaker. Someone whose hands are steady enough to perform the delicate work of maintenance and repair. Someone who listens for the frequencies that others dismiss as silence. If you are that person in your family, do not abdicate that role because it is uncomfortable. The discomfort of a difficult conversation is nothing compared to the devastation of a structural collapse that could have been prevented with a single honest word spoken at the proper time. And I believe the Lord provides even when the provision does not look like a blessing. He provided Doris with the foresight to build a case she could not remember building. He provided Connie Bellamy with 3 years of patience waiting for the proper moment. He provided Sophie with a curiosity that brought her to my workshop every Sunday, ensuring that the legacy of these hands would not end with me. And He provided me with the 72 hours I needed to transform from a grieving widower into a man capable of protecting the only things that matter. Looking back, this was never about the house. It was never about the money, or the deed, or the legal machinery that grinds forward, regardless of who it crushes. It was about a 5-year-old girl who asked her grandfather to teach her how to build things. It was about keeping my promise to her. The same promise I made to her mother 34 years ago. The same promise Doris made to me on a summer afternoon in 1991 when we pulled the magnolia roots from this garden and said this is where we will grow old. The promise is simple. We protect what we build, and we build things that outlast us. I stand here on my piazza, watching the last of the February light disappear behind the Cooper River Bridge, and I feel something I have not felt in a very long time. Not happiness. Exactly. Something quieter. The satisfaction of a project completed. The peace of a mechanism running true. The certain knowledge that when I am gone, the house will still stand, the trust will still hold, and somewhere in a workshop that smells of brass and old wood, a young woman will open a pocket watch, find a brass capsule, and hear her grandfather's voice telling her everything she needs to know. All things in their proper time. I turn from the railing and walk toward the kitchen door, the boards of the piazza creaking beneath my boots with the familiar rhythm of a home that knows my weight. Through the glass, I can see the mantel and the clock keeping its faithful count. The light inside is warm and gold. The house is quiet, but it is a living quiet. The sound of a mechanism at rest, fully wound, perfectly balanced, ready to keep time for another 100 years. Good night, Doris. The house is safe. The gears are turning, and Sophie is learning. I open the door, step inside, and pull it closed behind me. The lock turns with a soft metallic click, the same sound it has made every evening for 31 years. And for the first time since this story began, it sounds like nothing more than what it is: a man coming home. If this story reached something inside you, I am grateful you stayed until the final tick. I would be honored to hear your thoughts. What would you have done differently? What would you have forgiven? Leave your answer in the comments and let us continue this conversation together. If you have not already, please subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the stories that follow. Every family carries a clock that needs winding. I hope this one reminded you to check yours. And as always, a gentle reminder: while inspired by real themes of family betrayal, elder fraud, and the fierce love of a grandparent, this story has been dramatized for narrative purposes. If this content does not align with your preferences, I respect your choice to explore other stories that might suit you better. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you for caring enough to stay until the end.